This is Environmental Psychology, Unit 1, Part 1. Now, you might be wondering what environmental psychology is, because it's not something which is taught in many psych courses, but it's a branch of psychology that's really concerned with contexts. And the idea here is that individuals are embedded significantly within multiple complex local worlds that both shape and constrain behavior. So, for instance, you may act differently at home than you do in class with friends. You also may think differently depending upon who you're with. Or you can feel different emotions in different spaces. Some spaces make you feel calm, and others make you feel anxious. And so, what really environmental psychology is doing is studying the effects of these contexts on behavior and thought. Although I think that there's another side to environmental psychology that has to do with cultural contexts, which is what I am excited about. So, for instance, think about what you would feel like if you were in this space. This is actually Kyoto, Japan, along what's called the Philosopher's Path. This is where this famous philosopher from 100 years ago used to walk on his daily walk. So, how would you feel there versus a place like this? This is somewhere in western Pennsylvania. They're very different areas, they're very different environments, but they would probably result in very different feelings and thoughts if you were embedded in one of these contexts. And so the idea with most of psychology is that people have all thought and behavior really stems from the mind, from the brain. And environmental psychology aims to extend that and argue that really environments play an important role in our thought, feeling, and, as we'll find out, in our health. So, by definition, environmental psychology studies the relationship between environments and human behavior as well as how they affect one another. These environments include social settings, they include built environments, learning environments, and informational environments. So, for instance, an environmental psychologist would be interested in studying the way in which this course was designed, because it's a learning environment and an informational environment. And so what they might do is to look at this course and wonder whether or not presenting a talk like this over the internet is an effective way of learning, as opposed to other ways like being in a classroom. So other kinds of questions that environmental psychologists look at are, why are some spaces comfortable and others threatening? How can we enhance our environments to reduce stress, create more efficiency, and minimize accidents? And these are kind of questions that environmental psychologists ask, but as well as designers and architects and people that design spaces, because this is a broad topic that's of interest to lots of people. All of us live and exist in environments. I know that you're probably in a room right now, and you're surrounded by walls that have art on it. You probably, if you're at home, you made that space to feel as much comfort as possible. You certainly are not going to design your space to feel anxious and upset. So the idea is this is not just a topic that is of interest to environmental psychologists, but people in general are very interested in the role environments play in shaping our thoughts and behaviors. Another definition of environmental psychology is the study of human behavior and well-being in relation to the socio-physical environment. Now, by socio-physical environment, I mean the notion that our environments that we live in are shaped by historical, cultural, economic processes. So the fact that we live on streets that are designed for cars has something to do with what's happened in America over the course of the last 100 years. That cars became very popular in the mid-century, and we designed an environment that makes it conducive for driving cars like this. Whereas in other countries, like in the Netherlands, where I just came back from, car infrastructure is not emphasized as much as bicycle infrastructure. And so the environment is designed very differently there. And you have to be very careful walking down the street that you're not making the mistake of stepping into the bike lane, because you'll get killed. But that's just an example of how two cultures that not that very different from each other have very different environments, and it's a really interesting phenomenon. It's also the branch of psychology that's concerned with providing a systematic account of the relationship between a person and the environment. And so, whereas most of psychology really looks at what's going on either between individuals or within an individual. What environmental psychology is doing is looking a little more broadly and looking at, more systematically about how different environments shape people's relationship with the environment. So, for instance, one very common finding is that people don't like living in rooms that aren't rectangular. So if you have a room which is triangular or some other kind of shape, people tend not to find that pleasing. And so what environmental psychology has done, and one of the reasons why so many houses are built because with rectangular rooms, is that this branch of psychology has really identified that people prefer certain kinds of spaces. And so that's a area that environmental psychology deals with. So what is the goal of the field? The goal is to solve problems involving human-environmental interactions and to create, manage, and protect and restore environments that promote proper behavior. Now, if you're designing, say, a street and you want people to not get into accidents, what you want to do is understand how the individual on the street is interacting with the environment. So are there trees that are blocking signs? Are there aspects of the street that make it very confusing to the user as to where they are, that would distract them and potentially cause a deadly accident? The same thing for any space, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a prison, whether it's a school. Designing an environment that makes people flourish is a really important goal of environmental psychology. So another thing is that to diagnose problem situations and recommend solutions. So imagine that there is a space that is dangerous. For instance, in the 1960s, there were a lot of dormitories that were built so that there were not straight hallways. And the reason for this is they wanted to prevent people from congregating and protesting, because at that time in history, there was a lot of unrest among college students. However, what it did is it created spaces that were very dangerous, because not being able to see down a hallway prevents you from information. So that if there's a fire, down the hallway, being able to see down it is very important so that you can get out. So examples like that are where you would diagnose a problem situation and recommend solutions. So how do environmental psychologists work? Where would you find one? Well, you find a lot of environmental psychologists working in a field rather than a laboratory. There's very few laboratories of environmental psychology because in order to do the kind of work that you do as an environmental psychologist, you need to actually test different environments, and by definition, a laboratory is only a single environment. So most of the experiments that are done in environmental studies are done out in the field. So for instance, there have been studies on recycling behaviors where people have gone out and looked at what people put in recycling bins as a way of figuring out how good are people at recycling. So environmental psychologists also assess, analyze, and advise on personal space and environments in general. Personal space is a concept in environmental psychology that's pretty central. It has to do with the idea that people like to have their own space, and when you violate that space, that makes people uncomfortable. So, for instance, when I lived in Japan, in Tokyo, there are actually trains where this line called the Yamanote line, where they have people that are hired by the railroad to shove people into the actual train car. And so you're smushed among other people. And unless you're used to it, it's a very unsettling experience to have a Japanese businessman almost between your legs and a Japanese schoolgirl under your arm. It's just a really weird thing. But it happens there. And I'll find a photograph of it to show you at some point when we talk about personal space. But environmental psychologists usually work in teams with other professionals, such as urban city planners, architects, economists, engineers, and designers. So normally an environmental psychologist is not working on their own and on their lonesome. Usually they're working to solve an actual problem, like how to get people to recycle better, or how to, get people to move through spaces better, or how to get people off of a plane quicker. And that's a thing that frustrates many people, why they can't come up with a better system for airlines. But that's a kind of question that an environmental psychologist would deal with. And so that's where you'll find them working.